This is chapter 6 this week, and it's an interesting chapter that is, we're going to learn more about friendship and dating based on gender. So, the title of this chapter is The Gender of Friendship and Dating. It's a long chapter. I'm going to see if we could get it done in one video, but we may have to move for, 10 or 15 minutes into a second video. We'll see. So to begin with, we're looking at the family initially. So love inside the family and out, as the heading says. So we're going to learn about all these different kinds of love that exist between um, people, human beings, but mainly outside the context of the family. In another chapter, we're going to look at marriage and family. But this is outside that context, primarily outside of the family. So, in other words, this chapter is addressing a separation between familial and non familial relationships. But that, as you'll see, that varies in different cultures around friendship. It's really quite interesting to see how sometimes those overlap, familial relationships and friendship relationships. So, because for example, in certain places, very close friends can actually become twins through a ceremony of some kind. So, what are kin? Kin are the people to whom you're related, either by blood or through symbolic ties. Symbolic ties would be adoption, step parents, step siblings, that type of thing. So in New Guinea, for example, you'll be interested in this, I'm sure, and I'm sure you noticed it when you read it. Uh, the men marry their wives not because they're deeply in love with them or romantic or that there's a special attraction to them. They marry women uh, in order to have their wives brothers as their best friends through marriage. It's kind of interesting. So as you might imagine, uh, sociologists and other types of researchers as well are very interested in discovering what friendship is exactly. And a key point to friendship is that we, for the most part, do not get to choose our family, but we do choose our friends. And so, how we make those choices and what they entail and how long they last and what their meaning is in our culture and our society is the kind of thing that we're going to be exploring today and in other societies as well. So the philosopher C.S. Lewis says that these two different criteria, choice and obligation, those two criteria, they're partly what makes friendships unique and often, as some of you probably have experienced, more satisfying than other types of relationships. So we choose our friends with a freedom that doesn't exist in most other relationships. That's the choice. There are usually fewer strings attached, and so the obligations. And so friendships are both they're voluntary in most cases, and they're also more altruistic. Altruistic means that we, you know, without strings, we care about people. It's not a quid pro quo. Quid quo quo. We want the best for our friends, and we will help them, and usually in ways that will benefit them. So, a sociological approach to friendship really helps us understand the ways, you know, friendship, like many other behaviors, is also highly influenced by social structure. Now, as you'll see, we talked about choice, but as your text says, how much choice do we really have when we choose our friends? Because as we'll see, you have to know someone to become friends with them, whether that's, in person, online, however, you have to have contact with them. And there are a lot of structures that define who we come into contact with in one context or another. So, first, we're going to define friendship. Friendship, in the definition, this kind of standard definition of friendship, involves the attributes we've already discussed, which is that it's involuntary, is voluntary. We choose our friends, and altruistic. We care, about their well-being. But it also involves sentiment. We have warm feelings for our friends. We have sentiments about them. And it also involves sociability, of course. So, sociability is the concept from a social theorist, George Simmel is his name, that conveys the idea of being social purely for the sake of enjoyment. That's what sociability is. There are many people that we must be social with that is not for the sake of enjoyment, that we come in contact with, we have lunch with, think about workplace, situations like that, some family situations. But sociability, in where you're social, but there may not be a lot of enjoyment in it. So that's the implication of the term sociability. Okay. And so uh, sociologist, social scientist Lillian Rubin, she's written many books on these types of subjects if you're interested. She asked the question of her subjects, what is a friend? And answers included, as you might imagine, uh, things like trust and honesty, respect, commitment, safety. That's a huge one with friends, isn't it? You're not going to be close friends with someone that you don't feel safe with. So, safety, support, generosity, loyalty, mutuality, you care about each other, constancy, understanding, and acceptance, which is another huge one with friends, isn't it? Feeling accepted. So a common definition of sociology of friendship in sociology is a voluntary, remember the choice part, voluntary, informal, and personal relationship. But now what we're going to explore is what we talked about a little bit earlier with choice, is how voluntary is it actually? Now, we'll get to that in a minute, but now we're going to look more at how men and women relate to friendship. So Rubin's research uh, was a part of it was on what's called the reciprocity of the people identified as friends. Is there a reciprocal relationship? I do for you, you do for me. I do a favor for you, you do a favor for me, etc. So she looked at that, and she said from her research that actually, when looking at reciprocity uh, of people that were identified as friends for the subjects that she had in her research, it actually caused her to have some doubt about the personal nature of the relationships. Because what she found, and this is, once again, we're getting to choice and the voluntary part. What she found was that friendship is more likely to be a relationship between status equals. So people in the same social status, same income, same education, that type of thing. So people who are mostly on the same social level. Then she looked at this question, which comes up all the time about friendship: who's better at friendship, men or women? Okay. Well, this is one of the long parts of exploring gender and friendship. So, when asked the question, who's better at friendship, many, if not most people, and you probably experienced, give women, the blue ribbon prize in the area of friendship. Because, and we're going to explore this even more, the characteristics of friendship in our culture, in Anglo-European cultures, are intimacy, trust, caring, and nurturing. Now, think about those terms. Those are terms that are generally applied to women, not to men. So, psychologists and other researchers have pointed out that the quote mask of masculinity that boys and men are socialized into uh, can make forming intimate and meaningful relationships difficult, whether they're friendships or love relationships, because the boy quote code, as it's called, equates masculinity with being stoic, invulnerable, physically tough, independent. So intimacy and sharing are for girls. They're wimpy, right? They're for girls and for gay men from this boy code perspective. So as boys reach adolescence and early adulthood, the boy code becomes the guy code. And it's documented by Michael Kimmel in his book Guyland. It's called Guyland, where he, through his research, says that men ages 16 to 26 feel that they need to shut down emotionally and to suppress emotions like compassion. Remember, that was one of the characteristics of friendship, and to inflate and emphasize ambition as opposed to compassion. So, other research also confirms this transition because before puberty, boys describe their relationship uh, with best friends as, you know, characterized by closeness and intimacy. That's before puberty. And those terms, once again, are ones we think about as women having in friendships, closeness and intimacy. But just a few years later, after puberty, boys often explain that they no longer even have a best friend because, as one said, you just can't trust anybody. So researchers like Kimmel suggest that there's nothing, quote, natural about this process. Rather, it's a reflection of the dictates of, remember that term, hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic, that total way of having the expectations of having to be as a male. In other words, so if closeness and intimacy are in friendships is associated with femininity, well, by definition, then, boys have to avoid that, right? Any kind of intimacy and closeness. And the picture that emerges from Kimmel's research is one of men who become pretty incompetent, actually, at making, being, and keeping friends. Now, here's another factor of this. On the other hand, because there's other ideas about women's friendships, right? The writer, social media critic, and feminist icon, Roxane Gray, wrote an essay called How to Be Friends with Another Woman. And item number one on that list is, quote, abandon the cultural myth that all feminine relationships must be bitchy, toxic, or competitive. Because that's another story other than the compassion and intimacy and caring of women's friendships. The other storyline is this toxicity and bitchiness and competitiveness. Okay, so what does social science research tell us about the nature of gender and friendship? First, we're going to look at it in a historical perspective, as we usually do in this text with things. And so, in a historical perspective, it actually varies a fair amount because in many eras, going back to ancient Greece, men's friendships were considered to be the ultimate model of friendship, and women were seen as mostly incapable of this higher form of relationship that included loyalty, duty, and heroism. So those were um, typically, stereotypically masculine qualities, right? Loyalty, duty, and heroism. And that male friendship was based on that in many different eras, as I said, going back to Greece. So, but even in the early 19th century, manly love, as it's put, thought of or was used as a terminology at that time, the early 19th century, was an important part of the definition of masculinity. That's only, slightly over 100 years ago. But women, on the other hand, were considered to be unable to commit to other women and not able of forming close bonds because women's friendships were thought to be easily abandoned in favor of male companionship and also in jealousy and competition over men. So that concept is you'll drop any friend if a guy shows up and asks wants to be with you. So why those are older ways of thinking. We're talking about as early into the 19th century, which was actually less than 100 years ago, getting into it. So that's changed now, those ideas. Why was there such a radical shift in how people think about the relationship between gender and friendship? Well, for one thing, as researchers point out, men's friendships and men's lives in general were more public and viewed as more important than the relationships in the private sphere of women in the past, because you have this doctrine of the spheres, where the sphere of the public sphere was the men's sphere. The private sphere of the home was a woman's sphere. And in fact, in the late 18th and early 19th century, there was a terminology called angel in the house, and a poem written about that, who was the woman, the head of the house, the mother, or the eldest woman in charge of the house. She was the angel in the house, and that was her domain, her sphere. She took care of that. So and we're going to talk more about that in chapter 8, that doctrine of the spheres. So that views the public sphere of politics and the economy as inherently masculine. And it's really been only fairly recently, with the emergence of feminism, that what's happening with women's lives has become important to research and investigation in general about what's going on. And because women's domain or sphere was in the privacy of the home for the most part, their friendships were less visible. Uh, and so this idea of women as inferior friends can also be understood as part of a long history of patriarchy in Western society. And the other interesting thing is that it's possible that women are now perceived as better at friendship, precisely because friendship in general is viewed as less important than it was in the past, right? Social media is an example of that, and quote friending someone. That's not friendship. That's not deep, committed, long lasting. And look how easily one can unfriend someone. That terminology didn't even exist. Ghosting and unfriending is new terminology in the area of friendship relationships. So we're going to look more at the gender differences in in friendship, excuse me, here. So there's a lot of contradictions and points of difference in the research, and as you might imagine, about women's and men's friendships. But there is an extensive amount of research on it, even though there's differences in it. So we talked in the previous chapter about sex difference research. And so that type of research has been the basis of a lot of studies between about men's and women's friendships, about the differences between them. So it's really important to note that there are many similarities as well in men's and women's friendships. And there's also a lot of variation among different groups of women's friendships, once again based on social class, race, ethnicity, etc. And the same with men, lots of differences within different groups of men. But the studies of men and women as they have evolved define friendship, how men and women define friendship, the research into that, asking them questions about that. There are crucial similarities that emerge because both men and women want the same set of qualities in friends, which is intimacy, acceptance, trust, and help. So now we're going to look at this very interesting face-to-face and side-to-side. You'll see this so much in the film that I put up the clip of Deborah Tannen's You Just Don't Understand. These are very young children in the film, but it's humorous and interesting at the same time. So face to face, side to side. So women tend to look for an intimate confidant with whom they can share their feelings, and men tend to share activities and interests. That's what they're looking for in friends. And so the face to face of women's friendships really describes the degree of conversation and emotional sharing that occur. But the side to side of men's friendships describes the activities that they're participating in, but not necessarily any conversational intimacy that is the kind that women are involved in. So face to face is this conversational intimacy with one another that women partake in, and side to side are more like activities that men partake in. I searched and searched and searched for another clip from the Deborah Tannen film that you are going to watch, because it's the one that you can see that I could find on YouTube is of very young children, boys and girls, in their conversational style. But later in her film, You Just Don't Understand, there is a scene with teenagers that is almost hysterically funny. So is the younger one that you're going to see. But in the teenage one, hold on just a sec. So in the teenage scene, uh, there's a room with a couple of chairs in it. And they just asked, the researchers just say to these two young guys, they're probably about 15 or 16, we just want you to go in this room and, talk to each other for 5 minutes. Okay. And they film it. I don't know if the boys know they're being filmed or not, to tell you the truth. But what happens is the young men walk into the room. They put the chairs, because the researchers didn't set up the chairs in any way. They're just like, around in the room, a couple of chairs. And the young man put the chairs side by side. This is where this terminology comes from. They sit in the chairs, and the reason it's so humorous is I think there's only one time where one of the boys looks, or young man looks at the other one. They talk, and you can't even really hear what they're talking about that clearly, because it doesn't matter. It's their body language that the researchers are looking at. So they talk. One of the guys puts his, leg up on his other leg, and they leans forward a little bit. They never once turn to face each other, which would be difficult anyway, since they set up the chairs so that they couldn't. They're looking straight ahead and talking straight ahead. The girls come in, and how do you think they set up the chairs? Face to face. And then they lean into each other to talk so that their faces are close to each other. So at any rate, big difference. I wish I could have found it, but I couldn't find the whole film to see online. There are places you can rent it. It's called You Just Don't Understand, Deborah Tannen, if you're interested in seeing the whole film. So conversational intimacy for women, and for men, it's more about sharing activities. So these explanations, and the research attempt to account for gender differences, because many of them, you'll see these research theories that try and explain these behaviors, these different behaviors, are from theories that we've covered in earlier chapters. So the first, of course, is the importance of socialization in men's and women's orientation towards friendship. And so to explain these differences, Lillian Rubin notes the very important aspect of mothering, the importance of mothering to both boys and girls, because for both, their first relationship as infants and toddlers is with a woman, right? Their mother. And girls develop, therefore, this may ring a bell from the previous chapter. Girls develop a sense of connection, how to become feminine, and in adult friendships, this makes connection with other women much easier, of course. So, because in psychoanalytic language, it's because women have relatively weak ego boundaries with each other. They haven't had to have intense ego boundaries because they're the same as you'll see these two little girls in a Deborah Tannen film that you will be able to see. Boys are also deeply attached to their mothers, of course, at early ages, but they have to learn masculinity by denying their connection to their mothers. And this is the psychoanalytic theory. They learn masculinity not through direct experience as girls do with their mothers, but by identifying with their absent and less present fathers. So breaking their connection with their mothers means they have to develop more ego boundaries. And later in life, these very strong ego boundaries that they've developed make connecting intimately more difficult for them. So doing things together is easier and safer than talking, self-disclosure, and affection. So once again, side-by-side activities is both easier and safer than the face-to-face leaning in and telling secrets and disclosing one's feelings. For boys, another explanation that relies on socialization emphasizes the content of masculinity as gender identity. So we've talked about hegemonic masculinity before, but here's a little refresher. What that does is it sets up a certain bar that men must pass in a kind of masculinity test. And the idea of hegemonic masculinity is that men feel pressure to conform to this ideal of masculinity, and there are repercussions if they stray away from that dominant form of masculinity, which is to be competitive and rational. So if competition's an important aspect of masculinity, it's pretty hard to be a intimate friend with someone because you're not going to reveal any vulnerabilities or weaknesses to another man. In addition, hegemonic masculinity has a very strong heterosexual component, i.e., real men are not gay, and they don't engage in any behavior or activity that could be perceived as affection for other men. And we're talking about just friendship affection here. So Lillian Rubin found in her research that men commonly associated male friendship with homosexuality. And in our society, open and intimate expression of emotion are often perceived as something gay men do, and therefore they're outside of bounds for men. And I have to remind you of a few things here, or tell you if you don't know. You know, French people, when they greet each other, kiss on either cheek. And men to men, as well as men to women and women to women. So men, when they greet each other, kiss themselves on, kiss another man on either cheek. And in the Middle East, men who are friends walk around holding hands. Now, years and years and years ago at SWAC, we had Middle Eastern foreign students, all males, of course. They weren't sending young women over at that point. And in the cafeteria, it was a big brouhaha at one point. This was many years ago, 20 years ago, or more. There was a big thing because two of the young Middle Eastern men were holding hands, walking around with their arms around each other. That's totally acceptable male friendship behavior in most Middle Eastern countries, but in Coos Bay, it didn't fly, and so there had to be some, you know, intercultural education going on there and discussion about what the situation was. So, what are the institutional explanations of gender differences? And those institutional explanations of the gender differences in friendship emphasize the importance of the social structure. So you remember, it's a top-down way of looking at things. So men and women have different, from this theory, from institutional explanations of social structure. The reason that there's different types of friendships between men and women is not only because of, internalized gender identity, but also because of the social structure of our lives. And this explanation emphasizes the very real constraints placed on friendship. The structural requirements to friendship don't have a lot to do with our own personal friendship preferences, because, duh, you have to meet someone to become friends. And that usually requires the same physical space. Now, I understand about, social media today and all of that. One has to question once again if that's what traditional, true, real, authentic friendship is. I'm sure in some cases it is, but in most cases, there's this face-to-face, relationship that creates deep, deep friendships. So to meet someone you're going to be friends with, you have to be in the same space, and primarily physical space, but we can talk about cyberspace as well. So even with the online relationships, even with them, there are certain structural constraints. Because if all your friends are somebody you met playing a certain game, well, there you go. They're all people who are playing a certain game, okay? Or they're in a certain chat room. You are still limited to the set of people in the world that you have access to. And and to people who have the technology, actually, or the know-how to play those games, etc. So geography is another structural constraint to friendship, because you're not less likely to become friends with someone on the other side of the planet, although of course, with the internet we can do that now. But even if you're in the same town, there's different levels of what's called social segregation for the different groups in a town. First, there's the residential segregation, because in the U.S., where you live, is usually segregated by race and class. And in other countries, it could be religion or ethnicity that separates people residentially by where they live. So in addition, for many Americans, Latinos, Blacks, Asian Americans, and Native American people, and whites to that extent, although you may live close to people of other races or ethnicities, there are socially constructed boundaries that are in force, so that you usually don't come in much contact with each other. So the chances of becoming friends with someone of a different race or social class is fairly low based on research. And social class background constrains friendships not only through geography, but also in access, of course, as we know, to material resources. Money is an example. And think how hard it is to be a friend where there's a huge difference in status in terms of disposable income. So status inequality with money puts a real strain on relationships in general, and especially on friendships. Because friends, generally, part of the idea of friends is this kind of unspoken norm of equality, that you're kind of on the same plane in terms of those types of things. And so those things we just talked about, social class and racial or ethnic identity, are two examples of social structure that influences friendships. And that can change too with propinquity. Propinquity simply means to be in close proximity physically to someone. So when you go to college, for instance, suddenly you are in close proximity to people you may not have been in terms of race, ethnicity, social class, etc., and even gender previously. So that's an example how that could actually kind of morph and change through where you are physically, propinquity. Now, the next section is kind of interesting. Can white women and black women be friends? And this is race, gender, and friendship. And that was a question asked by the African American author Kim McLaren. The two major things that she identified in her survey of black, and this is an example of, once again, this social structure aspect of what happens. Okay, and this is one based on race. So, two major themes that McLaren identified in her survey of black women from the ages of 20 to 60 have to do with power and invisibility. Because the privileges afforded to white women by their race, because of those privileges, they have power that many black women do not. And white women have also been unwilling, many of them, to share that power with black women. And it's important to understand that it's white women who receive the most benefits from affirmative action simply because there are more white women than black women. And in her research, she found that many black women felt that white women chose race over gender, where in a situation where they would side with white men over black women. So a key point is that true friendship requires what's called reciprocal goodwill. You each, the reciprocal is you each have this attitude toward the other, and that's goodwill, that you wish the best for the other. Okay. So, and that's in this case a mutual acknowledgement of personhood. Okay. We're equal as human beings, as people. Your personhood is as valuable as mine. However, many white women see black women as stereotypes of different sorts, either angry black women or black superwomen. And we have been seeing the angry black women stereotype in the news recently with the trials. And, you know, they're uppity, I've heard that term used a couple of times, uppity black woman district attorney, for example. So both personal experiences and anecdotal data support research findings on these kind of research findings on cross-cultural research that race is an important influence in our perception of others. And we have implicit racial biases. I'm sure you're very familiar with this, which are the unconscious attitudes or stereotypes associated with someone of a different race. I think I told you in a previous lecture about the subway robber research, where they researchers showed a film of just a few minutes, couple of minutes, of someone being mugged on a subway by a male, and asked the people who watched the video, the quote witnesses, what they saw, and they all saw a black male mugging a white person, but it wasn't a black male, it was a white man. And so it's quite interesting to see there's an example of implicit bias. So that's important. So in those ways that we just described, race is often a barrier to women's friendships. And that's especially regarding something called identity support, which is the extent to which friends accept and affirm their friends or the other person's identity, even if that identity is a group that's been challenged or threatened. And you could also, identity support, I'd say another word is respect, probably. So what are the gender similarities in friendships? Are women and men really all that different in their friendships and relationships? Well, a bit. On the average, men are kind of less likely to disclose intimate information with other men. We talked about that earlier. But there are still a great number of men who do share. And in addition, some research shows that women's friendships are significantly different from men's only for women who aren't in the paid labor force or whose family takes priority over their work life. Because middle-class women who are oriented toward their careers are just as different in their friendships from working class women as they are from men in their relationships. So, across all groups of men and women, regardless of their position in the social structure, many core values of friendship are shared across gender boundaries because both men and women, even if one involves intimate talking and the other involves, uh, doing an activity with each other, both men and women value trust, value and trust, and want authenticity in their friendships. They focus on communication and trust and that type of thing. So, are the friendships really that different between men and women? Another researcher asked much more detailed questions about, uh, you know, larger questions. They're called global ones, like, that type of thing. So, global questions tell us a lot about the cultural expectations of friendship. So, what this researcher found out using these larger global questions uh, confirmed the idea there are important differences between men's and women's friendships. But when she asked their specific details about their friendships, so she moved away from the global questioning and went into specific details, she found interesting things. For instance, often men would say that this is the stereotype of doing things together, right? Activities that they went hunting or fishing with friends, um, but not that often. Usually, what they did was they sat around and drank and watched TV and talked together. And what they talked about was their relationship with their wives, their children, their shared interest in sports, work. And the reason they didn't do those activities like hunting and fishing and other things that often was because it cost a lot of money. These were working class men that she was talking to, and they just couldn't afford to do that with their male friends. So actually, they sat around and talked and watched TV together. And that talking relationship was closer to what a female friendship is. So, what those findings showed was this interplay between what society tells people they should do based on their gender, and then the actual experiences as individuals. And the contradictions actually were just as true for women as they were for men, as it turned out. They because when you ask the detailed questions, you find out what people were really doing. So, what is the intersectionality of friendship and gender? So, why did the findings seem to, radically contradict much of the previous research about the differences between men's and women's friendship? Well, here we go from the sociological perspective again, is that social class is a huge factor in gender differences in friendships. So we've already talked about how social class has a powerful influence on how many friends you have, who they are, what you do with friends, etc. But research also found that the friendships of professional women oriented to their jobs tend to be similar. They're more geographically mobile. That makes friendships more difficult to maintain. Um, in addition, once middle class people are in professions such as medicine, making new friends becomes more difficult. And here's a key point: the research on professional women. Professional women assume that their friends should be peer equals. Remember, we talked about status equals before. Same thing, peer equals, that their friends will be of the same social and economic status and professional status that they are. And as you move up the ladder of income, education, and prestige, there are fewer social status equals for you to be involved with and meet, and that type of thing. So, the influence of social class on the lives of working women and men, it turns out many researchers feel that social class is more important than the gender differences. It turns out that working class respondents have fewer friends than their middle class counterparts, but their friendships last longer. And they see their friends, as we talked about, is more informally in their homes, in their neighborhoods. They knew much more about each other's lives. Both the men and women in working class, social class, talk more about problems such as financial difficulties and substance abuse problems, family problems, that type of thing. So now we're going to look at friendship in a global perspective. And that's even more confusing often when you look at different cultures. So, for one thing, the English language, as is so often the case with other languages, other cultures' languages, has just one word basically for friendship. And that covers such a large variety of relationships that fall under this one term, friendship. And some social scientists have suggested that this lack of language to describe different types of friendships in specific ways suggests the historical decline of friendship as an institution in the United States. Here's an interesting statistic. The percentage of adults reporting that they have no close friends rose from 3% in 1990 to 12% in 2021. And today they are much less likely to have any social support. Okay, so that's a 4 times increase of people who do not have close friends. Choosing your friends. Globally, friendships are very similar to those in the US. They are assumed to involve a sense of sentiment and loyalty. In most cultures, they're the same as here. They're composed of individuals who like each other and who have a sense of obligation to each other's welfare. But we've already discussed how in Anglo-European society, the friendships aren't completely voluntary, but are constrained by social structure. And the same is true, of course, on a global level. You're generally friends with like people in terms of social class, even globally. The idea that sentiments like love for both friends and romantic partners can evolve only when the person is freely chosen is not a universal idea. It's not how other cultures necessarily think about friendship, that it has to be freely chosen. So we're going to talk about dating in a minute. The standard model in the US that love evolves as part of a careful process of sorting people, both friends and romantic partners, to find the quote right person to love. That's not a universal concept, as I know you're familiar with cultures that have um, marriages that are arranged by parents and marriage brokers and a variety of other things. So the voluntary nature of friendship across cultures is not necessarily all there, and the ceremonies and rituals surrounding it differ as well, because we have very few, if any, rituals that celebrate actual friendship in the U.S. The closest is the relation, or in Anglo-European society, the closest we have operating in the United States is the relationship of godparents, or among Latinx people, compadrazgo, which translates as co-parents. So that relationship, the co-parenting relationship, cements a pre-existing friendship between the godparents and the biological parents of the child. And that is the people who become the godparents become what's called fictive kin, fictive as in fiction, Fictive. They become symbolic family members. Also, in many cultures, there are blood ceremonies that cement friendships ritually. And, you've heard the term blood brothers. That's where that comes from. But, and in the Anglo-European context, in our culture's context, excuse me, until relatively recently, friendships within genders are usually more common than cross-gender relationships, and they still are more common. So, where do you draw the line between friendship and other types of relationships that involve love and affection? Well, in the US, we associate marriage with romantic love, right? And it's a relatively recent idea in history. And you'll see that in the film I'm going to show you in the chapter on marriage, how recently it is and how it evolved, that idea of romantic love. But does marriage have to involve romantic love? And also, when do just friends become something more than friends? Well, those distinctions, both in Anglo American society and other cultures, is not necessarily that easy to determine. So let's look first at families of choice. In the US, research suggests that friendships in the LGBTQ community are even more important than those among straight people, because many people in that community use friends as a form of fictive kin or families of choice. So the construction of elaborate family networks compensate for the lack of supportive family ties with the blood kin. And they are especially important among the LGBTQ communities, we just said, because they've often been denied access to support from their families of origin. And we see the same kind of dynamic happening often among fictive kin among immigrant communities for the same reasons. Their families of origin are back in the home country, and so a family is created in a sense here. Well, let's look now at what's called the rules of attraction and move from the world of friendship to other types of relationships. And that becomes more complicated, as you might imagine. We're going to look at dating and romantic love here. So, in the US, we generally, of course, as we said, believe in the concept of romantic love. We almost have a, a cult phenomenon about it. We have a holiday, Valentine's Day, to celebrate it. Apparently, there's another one that I didn't know about, called where is it? Sweetheart's Day. So in the U.S., romantic love has been thought of as primarily heterosexual and leading eventually to marriage. So, what's the definition of romantic love, the formal definition? It's an intense attraction in which the love object is idealized, there's an erotic content, and the relationship is expected to be long lasting. Now, this is a concept that does not even exist in some cultures outside ours. In many parts of the global north, the assumption is that romantic love comes before marriage, as you're well aware of. But that's not necessarily true in other cultures. And also, the ordering may be different as well. In many other cultures, from small tribal groups to larger ones, like in Hindu and Islamic cultures, marriage is often an economic or political arrangement. And love and intimacy are for friends or for other relatives, not for marriage partners. So, how did we get to this whole romantic love concept that we have in the West and especially in America? Well, of course, things are rapidly changing in our culture as well, with hookup culture, etc. But it's actually been changing pretty rapidly since the 18th century. And exploring these changes, and of course the huge gender implications, is a really good example here of the institutional approach, which again focuses on how social structure, courtship as an institution, for example, impacts people, how people experience their gender. Like other institutional approaches, of course, it is top down, as we've talked about. So we're going to look at this history quickly. During the 19th century in America, there was no such thing as dating. There was calling. And calling was when a man went to the woman's house, and the whole time they were together, they were in the woman's house. The mother supervised it. The mother decided who could come and call and who couldn't, what men could come and call. You could tell there were sometimes servants or some other person in the house who, if they didn't want this man to be calling, they could just tell him, sorry, she's not at home, you know. So the whole system, it was most prominent, of course, among the middle and upper classes in America. And it was a way to retain control over their daughters' marriages. And it was already then becoming increasingly difficult to do because of industrialization. And class hierarchies were beginning to collapse. People from different social classes were mingling more. It also allowed mothers to be the social gatekeepers and to patrol the appropriateness of the suitors through this convention of not at home that I just said, that you could just say they're not at home. Uh, Dating, on the other hand, emerged, you know, first from the lower classes, trickled up to the upper classes, and trickled down. Um, and the reason it started in the lower and working classes was because young women were working in factories at that point. And dating moved courtship into the public world where men had to ask women. It could never be the other way around. Men wound up spending a lot of money on dates, which there was some resentment for, which is where the idea came from of, you know, getting something sexual out of a date. So from the beginning of the 20th century, dating was the predominant mode, and then it turned into going steady during the Second World War, basically, when there was a deficit of men. And so that's kind of the brief history here of all of that. So to sum it up, you know, all cultures have some idea of love and intimacy, but obviously the way they're defined varies very much by culture.